All right, everyone. I'm really excited today. We're doing something a little bit different from the typical edibles content that I'm doing. And I have with me Dr. Whitney Ogle, and she's an expert in cannabis and exercise. So don't let me do all the talking, Dr. Whitney. If you could just introduce yourselves to the listeners of Bite Me and let us know what it is exactly that you do.
Yeah, hi. I'm Dr. Whitney Ogle. My background is in exercise physiology and how the brain talks to the body, so motor learning and motor control. I also have my doctor of physical therapy, and what I found so interesting was, as a cannabis consumer myself, was that out of all of those years of education, I had never once learned about cannabis. And so it was one of those things that I thought, oh gosh, one day I want to do research about cannabis because I know that people were talking about it. I would talk to my friends about going rock climbing and smoking weed before, rock climbing, and I just knew that there wasn't research out there. So I saw a posting for a job in academia at Humboldt State University. It's now rebranded as Cal Poly Humboldt. And I thought, I associate Humboldt with weed. And so I thought, all right, maybe if I go there, then I can start doing the research that I've always wanted to do. And so, yeah, I totally changed my area of research as soon as I started my job at Humboldt. And yeah, I've been studying how and why people use cannabis with exercise, and starting to do some other good research this semester as well.
That is super cool that you saw a gap and you decided to just go ahead and fill it yourself. I mean, that's a can-do attitude if I ever heard one. And of course, Humboldt is like the mecca of
Exactly.
of
Exactly.
cannabis. So you're in the best place you could possibly be for that kind of thing. And
Totally.
so you're obviously extremely well versed on cannabis and exercise, not only from an academic perspective and a research perspective, but it sounds like from personal experience, which is really cool. So maybe you can just start out and explain to the listeners how cannabis affects the body during exercise in terms of performance and recovery. And just to sort of put some parameters on this conversation, I am thinking in terms of recreational and amateur athletes, not professional athletes, because I think most of us listening here probably don't fall into the professional range.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's usually what our research is done on. It's usually been on people who are not professional athletes. There are some people who are starting to do that research on professional athletes, and it's amazing, and I'm so happy that professional athletes have actually kind of led the way in more of that public acceptance of cannabis use with sport, or just being fit at all and being a cannabis user. And so yeah, uh, I think this is an interesting topic. One of the things that when we first started our study, our survey of cannabis users, was that we found other labs were also doing the same research at the same time. And what the research has shown across the board with all of our different surveys of cannabis use and exercise is that people are using cannabis before exercise to help them enjoy the exercise experience. One of the interesting things that researchers found in like 2007 was that actually moderate exercise for about 45 minutes leads to an increase in the endocannabinoid system. So we have more biomarkers of endocannabinoid receptors or molecules in our bloodstream when we exercise. So that idea of the runner's high is actually stimulation of the endocannabinoid system. So there is this connection between the endocannabinoid system and exercise anyways. And so it was really interesting to see that people were saying that they used cannabis with exercise to help them enjoy the exercise experience, and helps with mind body spirit connection. People are saying that they are able to like be more flexible or lift more weights. We still need to actually research that to see if that's true or if that's just, stoner logic.
Right.
um, but yeah, that's what we find with before exercise, and then people are using cannabis after exercise to help with recovery as well.
Okay. So, I mean, it makes a lot of sense that if you can use something like cannabis to make exercise more enjoyable, because obviously exercises can make you feel better. But if you don't want to do it, then you don't get those benefits. So that's
Exactly.
interesting. Yeah. Now, are there specific cannabinoids that are most beneficial to athletes, and how do they interact with the body during physical activity?
Great question. And we don't really know the answer yet. There's a group of us researchers who are looking at different types of, cellular research to survey research to, different types of research. So I think that people are just barely starting to look at different cannabinoids. Right now, we've kind of only looked at just THC and CBD and just looking at it super generally, not going into um, the terpene profiles or indica sativa or however people decide to categorize cannabis. It's right now we're kind of just looking at like CBD and THC just generally, but people are saying that they are using more THC strains and more and I know that this terminology is kind of becoming outdated now, but more of sativa strains before exercise, and then people are using more CBD products afterward to help with
Okay.
recovery.
Right, that's interesting. And in your own anecdotal evidence, like, have you found that, like, so you don't necessarily find that CBD is as helpful prior to exercise versus afterwards?
What we actually find is that people who are using more CBD products have no difference in their running time or speed. They actually can participate at the same rate that they would without using any kind of cannabis product, and then they are a little bit slower when they use more THC products. And so just from kind of personal experience, I'm still learning what kind of products work best for me. I think that's one of the biggest things is that there is such a huge individual differences between from person to person. There are some strains that make me feel really strong and powerful when I'm running or doing yoga, and then that makes other people fall asleep. So yeah, it's a whole learning process to try to figure that out.
Right, that's pretty interesting too, because, I mean, for so long, cannabis has been, I guess, aligned with the idea of it being a performance enhancing drug, which it doesn't sound like it is necessarily. And like that, those feelings of like one cultivar might make you feel stronger and faster doesn't necessarily result in better times per se.
Yeah.
So it just goes to show how important this research is as well. Does cannabis influence pain perception or pain management for people who are using it for exercise?
Yeah, that's one of the big things that the research has been kind of promising so far in that direction. That there's more and more research that's showing that cannabis actually does help with pain and sleep. Those are the two that really across the board a lot of research is showing. And so in that case, it can maybe improve performance if you're able to, sleep better and have less pain. I think in some people, pain is a huge barrier to exercise participation. And so if you're able to experience pain reduction benefits of cannabis and that helps you exercise, then that's great. It helps to decrease that barrier for some people.
Right, and that's a pretty important one because a lot of us are dealing with chronic pain of some kind or other. So, yeah,
Exactly.
and if you don't feel good, you're not gonna exercise, and then you don't get those benefits again, which can help decrease the pain long term and all the rest of it. So,
The whole
yeah,
cycle, yeah.
does become a cycle. Now, does cannabis affect endurance athletes and high intensity sport athletes differently?
Great, another great question. These are all questions that we need to ask in the research, and
Right.
that hopefully my little research team is going to start to figure out this semester. But yeah, we find that across all of the different surveys of people who use cannabis with exercise, name a physical activity between archery and water skiing, someone's getting high and doing it. So like it's just people are which is actually kind of interesting because there are some activities kind of like you said that are more endurance kind of activities that use a totally different physiological system to be able to do compared to weightlifting or short intensity exercises. So people are using it with all kinds of exercise, and we don't know how much that impacts their performance either way
Okay.
yet.
So you haven't noticed a big difference yet, like you said, but that's why the research is needed.
Yes,
Yes, I
exactly.
love that, and I love that we're alive in a time where we can be doing this research because obviously prohibition, you couldn't even ask these questions about how cannabis affects us while we exercise. So
Yeah,
that's,
and there's still, there's still barriers to be able to do that research, and so there's, researchers from University of Colorado that have really started to open the door to being able to do research. They've worked with their risk management team and legal and everything to figure out, all right, we can't have people high on campus. We can't have people get high on campus, and so they have to either be close enough to campus where they can get high at home and come over to campus, or they bring the lab to the participants' home and do research
right.
outside of their home. One of the interesting opportunities in Humboldt itself is that we have consumption lounges. And so I talked to our risk management team, and they are okay with me doing research at the cannabis consumption lounges. I still can't get people high and bring them to campus. So there's still barriers, but we're finding our little ways around it.
Your little loopholes. That's really interesting because I talked to somebody earlier this week about consumption lounges and why they're so important and why we need them, and it looks like this is just another piece of the puzzle to say these are why these spaces are important because people need a place to go to consume cannabis and be studied while they're doing it. So,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
I think that there's a lot of cannabis users that are really excited to be participants in studies.
yeah,
There's so many students that come up to me in the middle of the semester and say, "Oh, hey, if you ever need a participant, I'm happy to be part of your study." It's like,
right.
all right,
Well,
well,
and I think that also helps to destigmatize cannabis as well because it's showing that there's athletes, whether you're just like a recreational athlete or you're taking it pretty seriously. I mean, it just shows that those people are also cannabis users, and
yeah,
it's not just that lazy stoner stereotype that we were all led to believe that's what you are if you smoke weed. So, yeah,
exactly. Or
yeah,
professors even.
right, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, you
and
can
the
be that
researchers
highly
themselves.
educated person and be
Yeah.
a regular cannabis user too.
Yeah. Now, does cannabis play a role in reducing inflammation and aiding in muscle recovery post exercise?
We are still kind of trying to figure that out. In one study, they found that chronic cannabis users, so not under the influence of cannabis at the time, they actually had more inflammatory biomarkers in their bloodstream than the non-cannabis users. So and these are both groups were highly physically active people, and so maybe it improves inflammation, maybe it's a placebo. Um, there's actually a researcher in, I think Kentucky of all places, that has been looking at CBD use specifically and inflammation and recovery from high intensity exercise. I think at this point, there's a lot more research. There's a lot more survey research that says that people say that it improves their inflammation, but we still need to do more research to really back that up.
Right. And when you're talking about like in Kentucky, when they're talking about the CBD specifically, would that be used like consumed by combustion or is it a topical or how are they using that CBD in those instances?
Yeah, and that's like there's so many different variables to cannabis,
Yeah.
obviously,
Yeah.
and so yeah, we need to look at kind of all of it. I don't think I've seen any research so far on topicals, and in my little research group that we've looked at, I'm sure that exists, and I just don't know about it yet, or hopefully it exists. But yeah, in the interesting thing with some of the CBD research is that a lot of times people are using it in edible format. And
Mhm.
so with the CBD studies that have been done so far, looking at athletes, sometimes they're using it as how many milligrams per kilogram of body weight, and so they're using like specific amounts for each participant, and usually that's like 700 milligrams.
Oh,
There was
wow.
another, yeah, and so that's usually what the research is showing is that, some of the gains that we see with CBD is, like, pretty high doses of CBD, and then I see that at conferences and I think, "Oh my gosh," like, when I go to a dispensary, I'm looking at,
Yeah.
like, 10
No
milligrams.
one's consuming that much usually.
Right,
That'd
and
be really
so,
expensive too.
uh, I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, 70 boxes of
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
edibles, yeah, that's crazy, and so, So yeah, then there was another researcher at Northern Colorado University. She was on my podcast a couple of weeks ago, Dr. Laura Stewart, and she was doing research where people were using maybe even like 50 milligram doses of CBD. And she was having a hard time publishing it initially because all of the other researchers were like, well, why are you using such a low dose? The other research that is supporting this is using much higher doses, more like the 700 milligram doses. And she's like, well, this is what's available to the public. So we need to actually look at what products are available to the public and do research with those products.
Right. That's really smart because, like you said, there's no 700 milligram CBD edible on the market that I've ever seen. So
Right.
even if you're making your own, like a lot of my listeners are making their own edibles, but I highly suspect none of them are that strong per dose. So yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. And it's interesting that you said that there hasn't been a lot of research on the topicals too, because those are so often sold as like remedies for arthritis and muscle pain and just general aches and pains and stuff. And it's, I mean, I guess if people are getting relief from it, then it must be doing something. But you're
exactly.
saying there's not necessarily any direct science behind it
Not
beyond.
that I've seen in athletic populations yet.
Mhm.
I could probably do a little Google Scholar search and
Right.
see if I'm wrong in that. See if anyone else has published that more recently. I haven't heard of that. I think sometimes in topicals they have other things in them, like that kind of minty kind of smell
Yeah.
that actually help. There is research behind that to help to decrease pain and or increase pain tolerance. And so, it could be the cannabis that's part of it, but it could also be all the other things that are in the product.
Right. Yeah. That tiger balm or the minty
Yeah,
eucalyptus
exactly.
like
Yep.
stuff. Yeah. The cooling gels and all that kind of thing.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, the cognitive effects of cannabis, like, have you found in any of your research that it can affect your focus and motivation for
That's one of
participants?
the things that people say that it improves, is that people say that it improves their focus and concentration while they're exercising. I think it's probably one of those things that's individual, and like uh, specific to certain strains. Obviously, some products make me really focus. I can tell that when I'm at the climbing gym and I'm like doing reps of certain things, versus other times where I'm like laying on the ground for half the time I'm at the climbing gym. And
Right.
so yeah, that's one of the things that people say is helping them with exercise. But yeah,
Right.
I think it's probably a little like strain specific.
Right, which sort of checks out with everything I know about cannabis is that it's so, like, personalized, like, how it affects you is gonna be very different from how it affects me. Have you looked at all at, like, any kind of time of day when people work out? Because for me, I tend to do some weightlifting. I do a little bit of weightlifting, and I tend to do it first thing in the morning, and I don't necessarily wanna get, like, really high first thing in the morning.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's a great question, and I've kinda done the same thing. That's why I don't go to morning yoga, because I
right,
like to enjoy cannabis before yoga, and so I'm like, "Well, I don't wanna be, like, high at 11 AM." And
right.
so yeah, I think that can definitely impact someone's, interest in wanting to have, the impact of cannabis before exercise.
Right. Yeah, because I guess you could use CBD, but you're saying there's not necessarily any direct, um,
I mean,
correlation?
if it helps you enjoy exercise, or like, decreases your pain, or, you found that it works for you, and, then that's great. And so
Right.
keep doing
Yeah,
it.
I'll have to experiment with that because I do like to do a little bit of yoga too, but that's more of an afternoon, evening thing, so it's a lot easier to be like, "Yeah, I'm gonna consume some cannabis first," because
Exactly.
I don't
Yeah.
have, like, interviews to do or, like, things like
I
that
have
where I
to
have to be
think
on my game.
deeply. Yeah,
Yeah.
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 What's interesting about the cannabis use with yoga that I've experienced personally is that, so I go to hot yoga, it's an hour and a half, and so obviously I would think that edibles would be a better um, source of or like way of consuming cannabis, because it lasts longer. But
Mhm.
I found, so I would take an edible, and then I would go for a walk around the neighborhood and smoke a joint. So I was like, high from the joint, and then during yoga I would feel the edible come in. And what I noticed was that actually I started feeling less stable and had more of that head rush feeling when you stand up too quickly. I had
Mhm.
more of that thing happening when I was using edibles, and I don't have that same experience with smoking. And so I actually stopped using edibles with hot yoga because I didn't like that feeling.
Right. Well, I can see that because some of those hot yoga rooms, for those listening that have never done it, can be so hot.
Yeah.
Like maybe the heat, and because I find sometimes the edibles can make me feel pretty warm as well.
Yeah.
So
Interesting.
the heat and the body temperature might be not a great combination for some people. So I'm
Yeah.
doing more yoga at home right now, like lately. So I don't really have that problem. I'm trying to get warm by doing yoga when I do it. But one of the things that I always wonder about too is how other athletes, manage cotton mouth when they're working out, because that's something that I deal with. Even though I've been consuming for a long time, I still get some of that cotton mouth. It's not as bad as it used to be, but yeah.
Right. And so and we always need we could all probably benefit from drinking a lot more water
Mhm,
just
yeah,
as humans in general. And so I think that cotton mouth might actually help athletes drink more water. But I have no idea. That would be a really interesting study to look at fluid intake in cannabis users versus
right,
like while you're stoned versus when you're sober.
right, yeah, that would be pretty interesting because that's one of the things I don't like about cannabis, one of the few things, but yeah.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
Now you touched on it earlier a little bit, but how cannabis impacts sweet or sleep quality,
Mhm.
and obviously, I mean, better sleep is better for everybody, athletes or not, so can you talk a little bit about sleep quality? Because I have heard occasionally sometimes that regular cannabis use isn't necessarily good for sleep. I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Matthew Walker. He's
Mhm.
that sleep researcher. And I think he mentioned that in his book. And that's not what I wanted to hear, but
I know that's the hard part about doing cannabis research is that
yeah.
especially like as a cannabis consumer, like I have my own bias, but I feel like the research has been biased in the opposite direction for far too long. So I'm okay having my own
Yeah.
little bias over here. Um, but yeah, there was a lot of research to show that cannabis can improve sleep quality. Some of that research has been done using like the formulas, like pharmaceutical cannabis, like epidot what am
Like
I
not actual flower, but like one of the
right.
pharmaceutical lab created medicines
Exactly.
that they're
Yeah, or
using.
like a
Yeah.
1-to-1 ratio, we still need to do more research in that area, but, one of the things that I don't know if other people have experienced as well, but, it makes your dreams go away. I don't know if you've ever taken a break
Yes.
from
Yes.
cannabis for a while, and then your dreams come back and they're really intense, and
Yes.
so I that's the one thing that I wonder with cannabis and sleep is that, there's probably I don't know, some negative impact of not sleeping. Who knows though?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's funny that you mentioned that because a couple times in the last couple weeks, like I consume cannabis most evenings, but I didn't. There was a couple of occasions where I didn't. And I definitely had like really vivid dreams. And I'm
Oh,
waking up like, what just happened? But I also have like an Oura ring so I can track my sleep. And I would
yeah.
say generally overall, like I don't see a correlation between my cannabis consumption and my sleep quality. A lot of it has more to do with, like, what time I went to bed and that kinda thing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
interesting. You
yeah.
know what? There was a study that a couple of colleagues and I had in mind for years, and we kept on submitting grants to get it approved so that we could buy equipment. But I wanted to get Fitbits for a group of people and actually look at their, heart rate and their sleep quality, objective data from a Fitbit, and then also that subjective data from just asking people, "How did you sleep last night?" We never ended up getting it
Aw,
funded, even though
yeah,
we submitted it so many times. So, we're kind of letting that one go right now. Hopefully,
right.
another lab will pick that up. But, yeah, I think, there's enough, consumer wearable technology that it would actually be kinda nice to be able to look at that yourself as a cannabis consumer. If you have a Fitbit or an Aura Ring, then, see how it does actually impact your sleep. If you think that it impacts your sleep, then try a couple of nights off and see if it actually does, impact your sleep in different ways.
Right, because some of the data that I have seen is like when I haven't consumed cannabis, sometimes I do sleep worse. And I don't know if it's I feel more disturbed or whatever, the dreams maybe. I don't know. I mean, I'm not a scientist by any means, but it is really interesting. Maybe you need to reach out to Ring and be like, help fund our study because
Oh,
I
I
think it
know.
would be super interesting to find
Exactly.
that out. Yeah.
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 There's a great company called, oh my gosh, what am I not thinking about right now? Uh, Tetragram, sorry. It's called
Mm,
Tetragram. It's an app where you can report your cannabis experiences, and then so you can put together kind of a list of what cannabis product are you using, different details about that product, and then you can say, all right, I'm using it for this purpose, and then it pings you back a little while later and says, all right, how did it actually go for you? So you can actually start to figure out what some of those individual differences, and then potentially doing research where we can use all that data that they're gathering from individual consumers to be able to find out, yeah, is cannabis actually helping with people's sleep? If they're intending to use it to help with sleep, is it
mhm.
is it matching expectations?
Right. That's really interesting. So I'll make sure I link to that in the show notes because if somebody wants to make their own contribution to some of the research, because are you saying that the tetragram is collecting it for research specifically?
In some, I think that's like one of their goals. I'm not sure where
Mm,
they're at right now with it, but yeah, Otha Smith III, he was the creator of Tetragram. He was on my podcast a couple of months ago, and so yeah, I highly recommend checking him out. He's just a great person, and it's a nice app to figure out what actually works for you, and then you
right.
can bring that to your doctor's office if you are using it for medical purposes as well. So
That's awesome. I'll be
you're
sure to link to that interview as well so people can learn more about that because that sounds really interesting. And obviously, again, cannabis is so nuanced and affects us all so differently. It really is a bit about, putting together the puzzle pieces to figure out what is best for you. So,
Absolutely.
yeah. Now, obviously, we're both like converts to cannabis use, as are the listeners of this podcast. But are there any risks that people should be aware of before they're using cannabis for exercise?
Kind of the same advice that you give anyone: start low, go slow. And
Mhm.
so, if you are not currently a cannabis user and you think that it's going to help you exercise, you know,
Right.
maybe try it first without,
Right.
pairing with exercise, or pair it with something kind of like low intensity, like going for a walk and, in a place that you know well, and doing exercises that are familiar to you. Don't, go out and, I don't know, try something really risky when you're
Right.
trying to use cannabis and exercise for the first time.
Right.
But yeah, it's you'll have some strains that will work for you and some strains that won't. And so, if people are currently cannabis users and they're not pairing it with exercise currently, then I think that's kind of an easier transition where you can, try doing some of the exercise that you already do while you're also stone doing it.
Mhm.
Or maybe it's like, yeah, I've always paired this with, watching TV or, something else, or gardening. And so now try going for a walk and, try doing something else. I had someone on my podcast, one of my first podcasts with my friend Danny, who was not a runner. He was a cannabis user, and he out of nowhere just started to try to run while he was high, and within a month he was running his first half marathon. And so
Wow.
he's just like one of those personality types, I think,
Yeah.
that kind of, is geared towards that. But it can be a gateway to exercise for some people.
And in that particular instance, what was it about getting high before he exercised, before he was running in particular, that gave him that extra onus, I guess, to do half marathons? Because for most people, that's like a lot of training.
Right, right. I think that's like one of those things, like personality type, like,
Yeah.
he's just like that specific. I smoke and, and run, and I've never run a half marathon, and I've done that for years. So,
Mhm.
I think that's just kind of his personality. But, a lot of us have had bad experiences with running growing up. Running was that form of, um, uh, if you did something wrong in practice, then your coach would say, all right, everyone has to go run a lap because, this person didn't do the right thing. And so it's been punishment for a long time for a lot of people. And so to change your experience with running, to change your experience with exercise, to have it be a better experience for you, I think is really powerful and
Right.
exciting.
Yeah, yeah, that is exciting, and I like the advice too of go low and go slow because that applies, like, all over the place and everywhere when it
Yeah.
comes to cannabis and trying
And
something new.
exercise. Danny
Yeah,
did
yeah,
not go, he did not go low or slow. He he
right.
went all in.
Yeah, but
Uh,
he was already
with
a runner too, right? Like, he wasn't like, "I'm just gonna start, smoking weed and powerlifting," or something like that. Like,
right, right,
yeah.
right.
Yeah. Now, I mean, we've talked already a bit about how athletes can determine dosage and timing to optimize for their workouts. Do you have any other advice around that? Because, I mean, we already know that it's very specific to each individual, but
Yeah, and that's, one of the things with the research and all the different variables of cannabis that we need to look at in more detail. Obviously, there's a time component. You said, what's the timing? And so if you smoke, that's you'll feel that immediately, and so that can help you, go out. That's kind of my process is that I smoke a joint while I'm, walking out to the trail to go for my run. And then I usually never run long enough to to get the effects of an edible, and so I would have to time an edible use. Like I'd have to take an edible, do other things around the house, and then leave for my run. And so that has just been kind of hard for me to wrap my head around how to time
Mhm.
that well. And that's some of the things that we need to think about with the research as well, is that you know smoking that's an easier study to do because you can just have someone do a test sober, come back in 10 to 15 minutes, max, and do the test again. So you can get a subject in and out in like half an hour,
Right.
versus an edible where, you have them take the edible. You could actually probably test them while they're like after they've taken the edible initially and then, an hour later. And so it's just more time consuming to do edibles research. People have done some edibles research with people using it on their own time scale. And so
Mhm.
you don't have to have them actually come into the lab. But yeah, it's one of those tricky things that we have to think about with research and how quickly it sets in for every individual.
Right, because yeah, with edibles, there's always a little bit of planning involved. There's no way around that really. But have you done seen any research or done any research yourself around tinctures or beverages as far as consumption goes?
Not yet, not yet. It seems like that's kind of up and coming, right? Like
Beverages in
more.
particular, yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. There's a brand called Off Field. I did an episode with Tony Fur. He's the CEO and founder of Off Field, and they make drinks that are specifically for cannabis drinks that are specifically made for athletes.
Oh, cool.
And so yeah, I reached out to them because I just kept on getting the ads because cannabis and exercise. I just kept
Yeah.
on getting their ads, and yeah, it was interesting. And so I tried it, and I don't know what they're doing over there, but that product makes me like amped, and I'm like running as fast as I as I
Really?
yeah, I feel, like,
Okay.
powerful with that. So, yeah, I'm not sure exactly what's going on with their product and their formulation, but that's a product that I've seen out there with, that's, an edible drink specifically for athletes or
And there's
people
no
who want.
caffeine in it or anything like that?
I don't think so. Maybe it's like L-theanine and, maybe there is something else in there. I asked the nutrition professor who, has her office is right next to mine. I'm like, "What is this? Like, look at the label. What is happening? Why am I so
Right.
amped when I'm using this?" And so, yeah, I have no idea, but check it out. It's,
Yeah, I will. That's super interesting because the beverages are becoming increasingly popular as far in the recreational market in particular, but the
Mhm.
onset time's a lot faster than a typical edible, which is another
Okay.
reason why people really like them. Like you can have an onset time of say 15 to 20 minutes maybe, as opposed to the
Really?
hour. And
Interesting.
yeah, that's one reason why people like them, and also they typically don't have the longer duration. Like, edibles can be, like, hours and hours, and a drink might be a couple instead.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because, actually, it's funny that you reached out to me at, like, just the right time because
Yay.
I was a judge for my first cannabis competition, this past month, for CannaFest. It's, in Humboldt County, and
Mhm.
I was, picked as one of the judges for the consumables. And, there were 2 products there that were drinks, and I found it so interesting because 'cause I'm always looking at the packaging and, like, how like, what are people saying about the product, and, like, knowing that there's not a lot of research behind a lot of these things, and so, yeah, with the drinks, it said, like, nanotechnology and
Mhm.
increasing, yeah, so, like, a 15-minute, window, like, fast acting, and I didn't feel it specifically or particularly for myself, but yeah, I think it did actually win one of the categories.
Right, that nano-emulsion is a whole thing in the cannabis drink world,
Yeah.
and obviously, whether you're gonna feel it or not is gonna depend on the potency of
Mhm.
that particular beverage as well, and, I mean, in Canada, they're all capped at 10 milligrams, so for some people, that's not gonna do anything anyway, but for others, that's plenty, and they could
Yeah,
drink, a lot less than that too, so
yeah.
it's very interesting, the whole cannabis beverages world. There's a lot of new things coming out. It's pretty exciting actually.
Oh
So,
my gosh.
yeah.
Oh, very
Yeah.
cool. Alright, well, then now you're giving me more ideas for research.
That's awesome. I love that. So, now, I mean, speaking of trends, have you seen any trends in professional athletes? Because you mentioned professional athletes, I think, earlier, just how they're incorporating cannabis into their training regimes. Because if cannabis can sort of be used in the professional realm, then it's better for everybody because that means it's becoming more mainstream.
Yeah, and I think that I've seen a little bit of both. Some people are saying that they use CBD to help with recovery, or they're using it with training themselves, like itself, like going out for golf. Like there's a couple of golfers that have come out to
Mhm.
be cannabis users, and I think depending on the sport, there's kind of a little bit of, golfers tend to not be, that stoner archetype. And so they might not lean into the THC kind of world. But, there's also other athletes that have their own cannabis brands. And so I think some of them are going kind of in the THC realm. One of the most interesting examples is Rebliati. He was a
Yeah.
Canadian
Yeah,
snowboarder.
I remember that,
Yeah,
I'm
and
old enough to remember that. Yeah.
he now has his own cannabis brand, and
Mhm.
so he's now selling flower, and
Right.
they're great names, snowboarding specific names.
Right, yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned the golfers too, but that sort of lazy stoner stereotype, because from what I've read about professional golfers in particular is they are the furthest thing most of them are the furthest thing from lazy, like,
Yeah,
they do a lot of training, and I guess you have to in order to compete at that level, and the
yeah.
courses that they're playing too, like, they're pretty vigorous, they're not like the courses I've played, which is
Right. Well,
short
yeah,
and
and then,
easy. Yeah.
speaking of, like, vigorous exercise, there's hockey players and football players and basketball players, like, that's high intensity. You have to
Yeah.
have a good, physiology
Stamina.
to be
Yeah.
exactly, to be able
Yeah.
to do that, and so, yeah, I'm just really hopeful in general that more athletes are talking about it, in general, and then that more sport organizations are starting to change their policies around it. That's the big
Yeah.
one. We're
Yeah,
seeing
'cause I
NFL change their
right.
policies, Major League Baseball, at triathlon has sponsorships with CBD companies. I guess I just heard recently that University of Southern California is doing a collaboration with cookies. So, like,
Oh,
somehow, you know, there's this intersection of sport and cannabis, and,
right.
policies are changing in the United States.
Yeah,
Yeah, in
yeah,
the
and I
world.
think I did read a while ago that the NFL was doing co-sponsoring a study with a university in Saskatchewan, I think it was,
Yeah,
and did
yeah.
they not also recently change their policies, like you mentioned, about whether athletes or not could consume? which is,
Yeah, so
yeah,
right now it's if they they're no longer either no longer testing for it or no longer finding the athletes if they are found with cannabis. It's more just a harm reduction kind of standpoint now, where if they notice that an athlete is really starting to not show up to practice, or like their performance starts to change, or their behavior starts to change, then they'll do more education. But right now there's a greater focus on education rather than getting people in trouble. But
right,
yeah,
which makes sense.
Liz Thompson from she's a graduate student at University of Saskatchewan. She was on the last episode of my podcast
Oh,
about
cool.
why is cannabis still on the list of prohibited substances in the World Anti-Doping Agency? And so
Right,
why are Olympians still not allowed to use cannabis?
right. And yeah. Do you answer that question?
Yes.
Okay, because I'm gonna have to go and listen to that because I find that interesting and problematic, I guess, but I don't, maybe there's a reason that I'm not aware of. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's yeah, the three criteria is that a substance is on the list if it meets two of three criteria. One, if it has the potential to improve an athlete's performance. Two, if it has the capacity to harm an athlete. And three, if it violates the spirit of sport.
Hmm.
And so yeah, there's kind of tenuous grounds for each of those categories. And so at this time, they're saying that there's not enough research to take it off of the list. But yeah, you'll hear in the episode. It's myself, Johnny Lozano, a postdoc at University of Colorado Boulder, and Liz Thompson talk about like why we think all three are problematic, and what
Right,
we need to do before the LA 2028 Olympics, um,
right,
where cannabis is going to be available and legal to people from all
right,
over the
yeah.
world who've maybe never had access to it.
Because that's the one thing too. I guess it depends on where you live, but I mean, all those things you said are kind of dubious, especially if you're in the cannabis community. But unlike other performance enhancing drugs, I feel like cannabis is one of the more easily accessible substances out there, and so that means a lot of athletes can use it. But I guess you are right that there are some places where it's not easily accessible, and I tend to forget that because I'm in Canada
Right.
and it's available everywhere, and I'm very fortunate, and I take that for granted sometimes. But
Yeah.
yeah.
I was just in Sweden this summer, and I still need to edit this podcast, but as I'm sure you
Yeah,
understand
I
the
do.
process. Yeah, so I'm still editing that podcast episode, but I was talking to a bunch of Swedish people about, what their thoughts are about cannabis and sport, and should it be illegal in sport. And what they've told me is that they say, Sweden's going to be the last country in the EU that in Europe that's going to legalize cannabis. They're like,
Really?
there's one store in Stockholm, and it's kind of on the outskirts of Stockholm, where you can buy cannabis. And so this interview is with the people who have that one pot shop
Oh, that's
in
cool.
Stockholm. And so yeah, they're like, there's so much education that needs to happen, because they're just people just don't even know that it could have benefits to people, and they just kind of think like, why would we use this drug? They're major drinking society, and so
Mhm.
I think that they could probably benefit from maybe switching.
Yeah, reduce some of that inflammation caused by alcohol, maybe?
Right, exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'll have that episode out shortly as well.
Okay, it's interesting that you bring that up too, because I was gonna ask next about how you see the future of cannabis in the sports world evolving.
Yeah, I think that again, like all these athletes that are starting to talk about it a lot more, and start having brands, the sport, the policies are changing, and so like there was just recently changes for NCAA athletes, and so I'm really hopeful that there's going to be this continued trend towards normalization of cannabis with athletes. And one of the things that I've talked with people about is, I don't know if you've been to any like fun runs where there's like a beer garden at the end of
Yeah.
the run or
Mhm.
something. And so I would like to have a place where people are running, but it's a celebration of consuming cannabis rather than drinking beer at the end of it.
Right. You could have cannabis beverages too instead, which I think
Well,
would
oh
be
my gosh,
fantastic.
that's right. Oh my gosh.
Yeah,
Okay, well,
yeah,
yeah, let's make this happen.
yeah, 'cause I think that would make it a real fun run, in my opinion, and you could have people smoking before too or consuming before if they wanted
Or
to as
during,
well. Yeah,
running and
whatever you want.
smoking a joint
Yeah,
or
I mean, you're outside, so you're outside. Yeah,
exactly.
yeah, I love that.
Maybe
Now
after living in Humboldt for too long.
yeah.
Um,
That's okay because I think we need that kind of positive exuberance about this whole thing out there in the rest of the world
yeah,
because a lot of people still have that stigma attached to cannabis, which I always surprises me, but it shouldn't because again, I'm in a place and I'm talking to people like you who are, very well versed on the benefits of cannabis and how it can help so many people. And even if you don't want to consume cannabis per se, you can use it in so many ways. Like maybe you just find that helps your achy knees with a topical,
mhm,
right? Like you
yeah,
can still benefit from cannabis that way without getting high. So, yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
yeah, it's been hopeful to, talk to my Midwestern parents, who are
Right.
very anti, cannabis who were very anti-cannabis until I started talking to them about it in a scientific way and showing
Right.
that there's actually credibility behind some of the things that I'm saying. And so they've slowly started to become a little bit more accepting of it. Um, my dad is one of those people who has really high sensitivity to cannabis. So he's not going to smoke, but he'll try edibles,
Mhm.
which is I think common with older adults in general. Is that people who in the older population are more likely to use edible products than younger populations. And I'm sure that's probably changing, especially with all these drinks that you're talking about. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited.
Yeah.
And but yeah, like he'll find products that are like 25 to 1 CBD to THC, and he's still like feeling
Oh,
it.
wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so he's
Yeah.
just super sensitive to cannabis for some reason.
I mean, I've met tons of people who could smoke a ton, but then they're super sensitive in other ways or vice
Yeah,
versa. It's just
right,
right back to that your individual biology at the end of the day. Cause, I know people that would eat 1 milligram of THC in an edible, and these are experienced cannabis users. And they're like, that's enough for me. And then I've met people who are like, I could eat 600 milligrams and be like, go about my day like nothing happened. So
totally.
yeah, yeah, it really
Yeah,
runs the gamut, but, I wanna be mindful of your time, I just have a couple more questions left for
yeah.
you, and this one's sort of switching gears a little bit, but what would surprise people about you?
Ooh, I don't know if being a cannabis consumer would surprise anyone anymore.
Probably not anymore. Yeah,
But yeah, that was something that I kinda had was, like, hidden about me that I wouldn't necessarily say it. Definitely not, like, just to the right people, I would kind of feel people out and see who it was safe to tell that I was a regular cannabis user, but yeah, I'm a daily cannabis consumer.
that's awesome, and so what was it that sort of made you comfortable with coming out of the cannabis closet, as it were?
I think living in Humboldt, honestly, has really helped that.
Right.
I there's a research group on campus called the Humboldt Institute for Interdisciplinary Marijuana Research. And so in that group, there's professors from all across campus that are doing different types of cannabis research. And so some are doing it related to sociology or business or Native American history. So it's like all of these different aspects of cannabis across campus, and I found even with that, I was still not letting them know that I consumed, and I was kind of surprised that no one was talking about like let's meet up for a joint after a meeting rather than like oh let's meet up for drinks. So I was kind of surprised with that, but I think having more friends that are in the cannabis industry here, growers who are growing the best weed in the country, in my opinion. Um, having friends that are, that leave in the middle of dinner, like after appetizers to go smoke a joint outside and then come back before dinner,
Yeah,
like the fact that that is normalized here, I think has really helped me, live into that and accept that kind of stoner um, uh, uh, characteristic.
Right. Yeah, I love that because it can take a lot for somebody to come out and start telling people, especially if you're uncertain of how they're going to react, because your colleagues aside, you just don't know if that friend of yours is going to judge you for it or think less of you, because some of that propaganda that we have been fed over the last however 100 years or whatever just is so damn tenacious and it's annoying. So,
Yeah, and that's
yeah.
where I feel like I need to say it out loud now because I have earned 3 graduate degrees and being a daily cannabis user. Like, you can still accomplish things, and I think that because I've shown my ability to be a productive member of society and do research and teach and, get all these degrees, that it is possible to still be a good member of society and, and be a regular cannabis user.
Exactly. And I see it time and time again. So, Dr. Whitney Ogle, where can people find you?
You can find me at Exploring Cannabis and Exercise on Instagram. And the podcast is called Exploring Cannabis and Exercise. You can find it wherever you listen to podcasts. I do respond to messages on DMs on Instagram. For some reason, that works better than email for me. But I do have an email, cannabisandexercise@gmail.com. Yeah, I'm always excited to meet other people who are using cannabis with exercise, other fellow researchers. I have a group of researchers from all over the world who are doing different types of cannabis and exercise research, and we meet a couple of times a year to just talk about what is everyone up to and how can we collaborate. And so, if there's any researchers out there, then let me know, and I'd be happy to welcome you to the group.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I'm really excited that we had this conversation, and I
Ew.
think you're doing really important work in the world. So, thank you for that too.
Thank you so much. You as well. Yeah,
Thank
I'm
you.
now I'm really excited to look into
Yeah.
to drinks now. My
I'm
gosh.
so glad I could introduce you to those because, yeah, yeah. All right.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks so much.